Hello. I wanted to do a couple of narrated PowerPoints again because I saw in the feedback that some people really thought that they were helpful. So for those of you that did watch it, I hope that you find it helpful again. This chapter is all about students who are deaf or hard of hearing. A couple of things that I think are interesting are, to begin with, there's two different ways of defining deafness. One is the psychological definition, which is all based on the actual decibels. So what percentage or what can you hear based on the decibels? So being deaf means that you're unable to hear sounds at 90 decibels or greater. Hard of hearing means that you have an inability to hear sounds below 90 decibels. So it's all concerned with the decibels. In education, it's concerned with can you hear to learn, basically, is what it boils down to. So being deaf means that you cannot process language, even if you have a hearing aid in. So with or without a hearing aid, you are still unable to learn through language. Hard of hearing means that with a hearing aid, you have enough residual hearing that you can process what's being told you. There's different ways or I guess times that you might become deaf. So congenitally deaf means before you're born. You might be born um, right after birth, which would happen typically, I would say, like during the birthing process. And then prelingual deafness happens before you have language, so before you begin talking, usually around the age of 2. And then postlingual means after you've been talking, you lose your hearing somehow. And then there's a continuum of deafness. So you might have mild hearing loss or you might have profound hearing loss. And that sort of goes right here. Most disability categories have some sort of continuum from mild to profound. And the way that it is determined for those who are hard of hearing are all based on the decibels, that psychological classification or definition. There's not a lot of students who are hard of hearing or deaf. Actually, just 0.10% of the population are. There's more students who are hard of hearing than deaf, and this is sort of just a fun fact, but 30% of students who get services in school for deaf or hard of hearing come from Spanish-speaking homes. So I don't know why or the research behind that, but I did think that it was a rather interesting fact. The anatomy of the ear, I am not an expert or in the medical field, so I do know the basics. There's 3 areas of the ear that can be impacted for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. But there's this little video. So there's one that's like a kid-friendly one, and there's one that's more adult, but the kid-friendly one is sort of funny. So I'm gonna play that one for you. Here.
Kids Health presents How the Body Works with Chloe and the Nurse. Skiddly bob, boom, a lot, chaka boom boom, yeah. Woo!
Tell me where it hurts.
I'm singing, not hurting. A do diddly dee.
I do love the drums.
I am drumming in honor of today's quest to the ear to see how we hear.
So you're playing the drum because we're going to learn how the drum in your ear helps you hear.
That was the plan, but having managed to climb up this tree,
You found that the getting down part is not so easy.
precisely.
No worries, as the ear is coming here to hear.
Delightful. Before we enter, did you know that there are 3 parts to the ear?
3 parts. Say it, Nerve.
The outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Woo-hoo-hoo.
I'm guessing that this, being on the outside, would be the outer ear.
What a clever Chloe you are. The outer ear, also known as the pinna or auricle, fancy word. The pinna or outer ear acts like a funnel, collecting sounds to channel them into the ear canal, which is also part of the outer ear.
What are we waiting for? Let's head inside the outer ear. Ooh, what's this gunk on the floor?
You mean this glorious earwax produced by the ear canal?
Nasty earwax is more like it.
Hardly. Earwax contains chemicals to fight off infections that could hurt the skin here in the ear canal and traps dirt to help keep it clean.
Okay, fighting infection and keeping the ear canal clean is important stuff.
Oh, yeah. Also, earwax will help us slide down the ear canal. Woo-hoo-hoo!
The little ear!
Where we find the eardrum. Quietly, my dear Chloe. The eardrum is a very sensitive instrument. Much better. Like my bongo drum, the eardrum is a thin piece of tightly stretched skin.
Do they work the same?
Very much the same, and also different.
Such a nerve thing to say. Explain.
A musical drum makes sound when we hit it, but no one's hitting the drum in your ear. The sound waves that your outer ear collected cause it to vibrate.
Sound waves vibrate the eardrum? Got it. What happens next?
When the eardrum vibrates, it moves a set of 3 tiny bones on the other side, called ossicles.
Ossicle? That sounds like a drum beat.
The 3 ossicle bones are called the hammer, the anvil, and the spirit.
Those bones sort of look like those things. But the sound's journey to the brain isn't over yet, is it?
Not even close. For that, we need to pop past the eardrum to the inner ear.
There are the ossicles.
And there's the cochlea. The ossicle bones connect to the cochlea. The cochlea is a small curled tube filled with liquid. The vibration of the ossicles create waves in the liquid in the cochlea.
Are those little hairs I see?
I'm so happy you asked. The cochlea is lined with tiny hairs. When the fluid in the cochlea moves, it moves the hairs and creates nerve signals that get sent to the brain. The brain understands these nerve signals as sound, and so you hear.
What?
I said you hear.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
But because you have earplugs in your ears.
A precaution in case you started singing again.
Oh, what a fine idea! 3 parts to the ear you will need if you want to hear outer, middle, and inner.
I think you got the point. Anyway. Okay, I think you get a little bit of the idea. When they identify hearing impairment, they use a screening test. They use all sorts of remember when you were little and you would wear headphones and they would be like beep and you raise your hand or whatever hand you hear the beep on. They still very much do that. And then if you fail that, there's other auditory tests that you do with an audiologist. There's different types of reasons or causes for hearing impairment. So one is a conductive, and that is where it interferes with the transfer of sounds. One is sensory neural, which is problems with the inner ear, or you might have mixed, which is a little bit of both. And you could also have a hearing impairment of the outer ear. There's a hearing impairment of middle ear. Most of the time that's correctable with surgery. And then the hearing impairment that happens in the inner ear is the most severe, and that's typically where the congenital hearing loss is happening. When you look at some of the psychological or behavior characteristics, a lot of it does impact your speech development because you're not hearing that language from such an early age. So we just want to make sure, a lot of times they catch it early. They actually test the hearing as soon as the baby's born using an air test or something, which is rather interesting. But anyways, if they find it early, they can intervene at an early age. Sign language, there's a little video, and I'm not going to watch it in this episode, in this recording, but if you want to, you can always look through the PowerPoint and find that. It just is somebody that's talking more about sign language. But there's some important things to think about in sign language. So the shape that you make your hand, so like if you're spelling your name, you need to make sure that the shape is correct. Also, the location of where your hand is. So like this says thank you, but if I rub my hand down here on my belly, which you can see, it means something different. So where I'm doing that sign could change what that whole word is. So not only does the shape of your hand matter, but the location that you're doing it makes a difference in the meaning of that word. And then the movement. So you have to make sure your movement's correct. Like the letter J, you move your hand. Or thank you, you have to move your hand. Or I think dad is, or maybe mom and dad. I don't know, this and this are two separate things too. And depending on where it is, once again, location makes a difference in what that means. But the way that you move your hand could make a certain word or a different word. How fast you're doing it, that does not matter how fast you sign. But these three things do make a difference. Sign language is not a universal language. There's actually three types of sign language. So we have American Sign Language, and then there's two other ones, and I always forget what they are, what they stand for. But anyways, they are not universal. They are not a universal language, and there's different milestones that people can reach in terms of how quickly they pick up sign language, and also cognitively, are they able to really understand and learn what all those sign languages are? When you look at the cognitive abilities of somebody with a hearing loss, there's actually no difference in somebody who has hearing loss or not in terms of IQ. So when we say maybe somebody with a hearing loss is impacted intelligently, that's not necessarily the case. So IQ does not matter, hearing loss or no hearing loss. Academic achievement is interesting. So they obviously have a hard time with reading because they're missing all that language input from the hearing and that language. But then they also sort of trail behind in math, and they really benefit from explicit phonics-based instruction. So same with when we talked about with dyslexia, that same instruction can help with people that have hearing losses. This is interesting, and it's in your reading guide, and it's in the chapter as well. But I always think it's interesting. So children who are deaf, they're born to parents who are also deaf, have a higher academic achievement. And I think it's because probably the parents who are deaf are well versed in sign language. They can communicate with their kids at an early age. They're using that sign language all the time. If a child is deaf and it's born to a speaking parent, they lose a lot of that interaction, even that they're going to gain in their everyday world. So if you think about it, if you have a child that's deaf, like if I have a child that's deaf, if I'm going to the grocery store, when I'm talking to the lady at the checkout, I'm not going to sign to her because she can talk and I can talk. But my child is not understanding any of that conversation that's happening between myself and the other person. Whereas if I were deaf, I might be signing to the lady at the grocery store, even though she can't understand it. I might be signing because a lot of times people who are deaf can actually talk a little bit. You don't always understand what they're saying, so sometimes they sign and they try to talk as well, and you can sort of, this signing indicates that obviously that they're hard of hearing, typically, and then it's sort of, you can match that with the language that they're trying to say. But anyway, so the child who's deaf is sort of seeing that in all areas of their life, where if you're born to children who are born to speaking parents are immersed in language at an early age. Also, the amount of inclusion affects the degree of social isolation. So if we have students who are included in the gen ed classroom most of the time, they typically find ways to interact with their peers with or without language. But if they're in a resource room with other students who are also hard of hearing, they might be doing well with social interaction with their peers because everybody in that room can have sign language, but they don't learn to interact with others. And so we need to make sure that we do strategic grouping. So we might want to make sure that we have somebody in the classroom that can do sign language, or that is a friend of that peer who they have somebody that they feel safe with in terms of inclusion. But we want to make sure that there's someone they can speak with. If we have them in a gen ed class and nobody knows sign language, then they won't have anybody to communicate with. So we always want to make sure that we include, we have an appropriate environment for that student. I went back. The deaf culture is very strong. So when we talk about people first language, the deaf culture actually does not prefer people first language. They are deaf first, and they are very proud of it. They actually are sort of anti the cochlear implants. They feel like it takes away the identity of that child. And so it's really interesting, and definitely something that I would suggest that you look into. If you want to look into the cochlear implant more, you can do that. There's really, really sweet stories about that. When you teach, make sure that if you're ever using auditory, you're also having visuals to go with it. And the book goes into this a lot more, so I would hope that you would go and reread that part, or at least read that part if you haven't. And make sure you use the total communication system. So you're talking, but you're also providing that input either on the board, written, or using sign language or something like that for them to see. I'm just going through this rather quickly. Most of the students will attend a local school, but some